You ever hear all those legal terms and your brain just kind of shuts down? Well, today on The Explainer, we're going to cut right through all that confusing lingo. We're breaking down how a law is actually made using analogies that I promise will stick with you.
It seems super complicated, doesn't it? All these formal steps and big, fancy words. But honestly, the core idea behind it all is something you probably see every single day. So let's dive in and map this whole thing out together. All right, here's our roadmap. First, we'll get to know the government's basic structure. Then, we'll follow an idea's journey to becoming law. We'll also look at what happens when things get paused and how these big laws actually show up in your daily life. And we'll wrap it all up with a super quick summary.
Okay, first things first, who does what? The easiest way to think about the government is like a team with three main departments, and each one has a very specific job to do.
So, here are our three key players. First, you've got the legislative branch. That's Parliament. Think of them as the architects. They design and create the laws. Then you have the executive. That's the president and the government. They're the construction crew. They take the blueprint and build it in the real world. And finally, you have the judiciary, the courts. They're like the safety inspectors, making sure the law is fair, constitutional, and applied correctly. Now, this whole setup has a name, the separation of powers, and it is absolutely crucial. It's kind of like a three-legged stool. Each leg is separate, but holds up the whole thing. This creates a system of checks and balances, which basically means no one part of the government can get too powerful and just do whatever it wants. It's a pretty brilliant system when you think about it.
Okay, so now that we know who the players are, let's get into the main event. How does a simple idea turn into an actual law that everyone has to follow?
To really get a handle on this, let's use an analogy that I'm pretty sure we can all relate to. Finishing a major college project. You know the whole process, from messy first ideas to that final polished paper you hand in. So every law starts its life as a draft. This is just the rough notes, the research, the brainstorming. Once that idea is polished, written up formally, and presented to Parliament, it graduates to being called a bill. And then, after all the debates, the votes, and the final presidential sign-off, boom! It becomes an act. That's the approved, graded project that's now an official law. But, it's not always a straight line. What happens if there's a big disagreement? Or what if a law is needed, right now, but Parliament isn't even in session? Well, the system has a couple of special moves for situations like these. The president holds a pretty powerful tool called the veto. Think of it like a professor's red pen. An absolute veto is just a hard no. The project is rejected, end of story. A suspensive veto is like getting your paper back with a note that says, revise and resubmit. It's not a no, but it needs work. And the pocket veto, that's when the president just does nothing. The bill just sits on the desk until it expires. It's like finding a permission slip in your backpack weeks after the field trip. It's too late. Nothing happens. Now, let's quickly compare an act to an ordinance. An act, as we know, is a permanent law passed by Parliament during their normal sessions. An ordinance, on the other hand, is a temporary law made by the president when Parliament isn't in session and there's an urgent need. So one is the standard long-term way of doing things, and the other is a short-term emergency fix. And this temporary fix has a very specific expiration date. An ordinance can only last for a maximum of 6 months and 6 weeks. Now, that's not a random number. 6 months is the longest possible time between 2 sessions of Parliament, and the extra 6 weeks gives them just enough time to meet, discuss the ordinance, and decide if they want to make it a permanent act. Okay, so an act gets passed, but an act is usually just a broad framework, right? It's the big idea. So how do these giant national laws actually get put into practice in our day-to-day lives? That's where the details come in. This is where we meet rules and regulations. Think of rules as the official instruction manual for an act. The government writes them to explain how to follow the new law. Regulations, on the other hand, are more like the internal rulebook for a specific organization or a professional body. They govern how that specific group functions under the new act. And now we're going to zoom all the way in, from the national level, right down to your specific neighborhood or even your apartment building. This is where we find bylaws. These are the super local rules made by your municipal corporation or housing society to manage the day-to-day stuff in your community. And you deal with bylaws all the time, probably without even thinking about it. That rule about separating wet and dry waste, that's a bylaw. The no loud music after 10 p.m. policy in your building, bylaw. Those specific parking rules you have to follow, you guessed it, all bylaws. But here's a really important point. Bylaws have limits. They can't overrule bigger, more fundamental laws. For instance, a housing society's bylaw can't stop you from taking your pet in the elevator. Why? Because courts have ruled that pets are part of the family, and banning them from common areas would be discriminatory. So local rules can't take away established rights.
Whew! Okay, we have covered a ton of ground, from the highest levels of parliament all the way down to your local parking spot. So let's do a super quick, rapid-fire summary to make sure all these key ideas are locked in.
All right, let's nail this down. A bill is the proposal. An act is the finished, approved law. A veto is the power to say no or send a bill back for changes. An ordinance is a temporary, emergency law. Then you have rules, which are the how-to guide, regulations, which are the internal rule books for specific groups, and finally, bylaws, which are your local neighborhood rules. Simple as that.
So now that you know all this, think about it. The next time you see a parking sign or a notice about waste collection, you'll know the story behind it. Knowing where these rules come from, whether it's a huge national act or a tiny local bylaw, really changes how you see the world around you, doesn't it?
Hey, if this explainer helped clear things up for you, do us a huge favor and hit that like button, subscribe, and maybe share it with a classmate who you think could use it. Your support is what helps us create more content like this to decode the world. Thanks so much for watching.